April 1945. Germany was dying. Not with a single breath, but in gasps. City by city, village by village, street by street. The Third Reich, once a roaring machine of conquest that had swept across Europe like a tidal wave, had become a graveyard of its own making. American boots marched through the rubble, past the skeletal remains of what were once homes, churches, schools, entire lives reduced to piles of brick and twisted metal. The air smelled of smoke and decay, a thick, choking presence that clung to uniforms and skin and settled in the lungs like a disease. Every step forward was a step deeper into a nation's collapse, into the heart of a darkness that had consumed millions. The roads were clogged with the debris of war, burnt-out tanks with their turrets blown off, overturned wagons spilling their contents into the mud, personal belongings scattered like confetti after a parade no one wanted to attend. Photographs, letters, children's toys all trampled into the dirt, and through this landscape of ash and ruin came the columns, endless rivers of German prisoners, soldiers, and civilians alike, shuffling westward toward Allied detention camps. Among them were faces hollowed by hunger, eyes that had seen too much, shoulders bent under the weight of defeat and shame and exhaustion so profound it had become a physical thing. But one face would stand out to Sergeant William Carter in a way he would never forget. It wasn't her exhaustion that caught his attention, though God knows she looked tired enough to collapse. It wasn't even the baby she carried, though that was unusual enough. It was the way she held it, like a sacred burden, like something that didn't belong to her, but that she refused to let fall, like the last piece of something precious in a world that had lost all value. Carter had been in Europe since Normandy. He had waded through the surf on Omaha Beach on June 6, 1944, watching men cut down by machine gun fire before they even reached the sand. He had seen the beaches red with blood, the water churning with bodies, the surf carrying pieces of men back and forth like driftwood. He had crawled through the hedgerows of France, those ancient earthen walls topped with thick brush that turned every field into a fortress, every advance into a nightmare of close-quarters killing. He had fought in the frozen hell of the Ardennes during the Battle of the Bulge, where men died of cold as often as they died of bullets, where frostbite claimed fingers and toes and noses, where the snow turned red and stayed that way for weeks. He had watched friends die, had pulled dog tags off bodies too mangled to identify, had written letters home to families he would never meet, trying to find words that would make sense of senseless deaths. By April 1945, he was 24 years old and felt 50. The war had carved lines into his face that wouldn't fade, put a tremor in his hands that only appeared when he tried to sleep, planted nightmares in his head that played on repeat every time he closed his eyes. He smoked too much, 3 packs a day when he could get them, drank when he could, and spoke less with each passing month. The men in his unit said he had the 1,000-yard stare, that look of someone who had seen beyond the veil and couldn't unsee it. They weren't wrong, but he still did his job. He still followed orders. He still believed, somewhere deep down beneath the layers of trauma and exhaustion, that there was a reason for all this suffering, that when it was over the world would be better, that the sacrifices would mean something. That belief was harder to hold on to with each passing day, with each new horror, with each young face that would never grow old. The convoy stopped near a bombed-out village outside Nuremberg, in the heart of Bavaria. The name of the place didn't matter. It looked like every other German town Carter had passed through in the last month. Blackened buildings with their roofs caved in, walls standing at impossible angles, shattered windows gaping like empty eye sockets, streets cratered by artillery, some holes deep enough to swallow a jeep. A church steeple stood at an angle, half collapsed, its bells silent and cracked. The cross at the top had fallen into the street below, lying on its side like a defeated symbol. A few locals watched from doorways as the prisoners passed, their faces blank, unreadable, neither hostile nor friendly. No one waved, no one shouted, no one threw stones or spat, though that had happened in other towns. They just watched, like witnesses to a funeral procession that would never end, like people who had run out of emotions and were now simply waiting for whatever came next. Some of them were old, too old to have fought. Some were women, widows probably, dressed in black. A few children peeked out from behind their mothers' skirts, eyes wide with curiosity and fear. Carter wondered what they thought of the Americans. Liberators? Conquerors? Did it even matter anymore? Carter had been assigned to oversee a group of about 200 German POWs, mostly women, children, and old men. The Wehrmacht soldiers had already been separated and sent ahead to larger camps where they would be interrogated, processed, classified. What remained were the leftovers of a broken nation, people with nowhere to go, no home to return to, no future they could imagine. Some carried suitcases held together with rope and hope. Some carried nothing but the clothes on their backs. A few pushed carts loaded with whatever they had managed to salvage from the ruins: pots, blankets, a single chair, a framed photograph. One old man dragged a wooden crate behind him, the sound of it scraping against the cobblestones like nails on a chalkboard, a sound that made Carter's teeth ache. He wanted to tell the man to leave it, that whatever was in that crate wasn't worth the effort. But he didn't. Who was he to decide what mattered to someone who had lost everything else? Carter walked the line, checking faces, making sure no one was injured or sick enough to need immediate medical attention. He had done this dozens of times. It was routine by now. Look for signs of disease: typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis. Check for weapons, though most of these people were too tired to be a threat. Make sure no one was about to collapse. The medics were stretched thin, and every case that could be avoided was a blessing. Most of the prisoners avoided his eyes. A few nodded when he passed, a gesture of acknowledgement or maybe just exhaustion. One woman spat at his feet, a thick glob of phlegm that landed on his boot. He ignored it. She was old enough to be his grandmother, her face a map of wrinkles and bitterness. He couldn't blame her. Her world had ended. That's when he saw her. A woman in her late 20s, maybe 30, though it was hard to tell. Hunger and exhaustion aged people in ways that birthdays never could. She was thin, like everyone else, her collarbones jutting out beneath the collar of her coat. The coat itself was too big for her frame, probably belonged to someone else once, sleeves hanging past her wrists, the hem dragging in the dirt. It was gray, or had been once, now stained with mud and God knows what else. Blonde hair tied back in a loose braid, streaked with dirt and ash, strands escaping to frame a face that might have been beautiful once. Her face was pale, angular, with high cheekbones and lips cracked from the cold and dehydration, and in her arms, wrapped in a wool blanket that had seen better days, was a baby. The child couldn't have been more than 6 months old, maybe younger. It was hard to tell with babies, especially ones that hadn't been eating well. It wasn't crying. That struck Carter immediately. Most babies in these columns cried, hungry, cold, scared, sensing the fear and despair of the adults around them. But this one just stared up at the woman with wide, unblinking eyes. Blue eyes like chips of ice, clear and focused in a way that seemed impossible for something so small. The baby's face was clean, or as clean as it could be given the circumstances. Someone had been taking care of it. Someone had been wiping its face, keeping it warm, making sure it survived. Carter approached her, his boots crunching on the gravel. His German was rough, cobbled together from phrase books and conversations with prisoners and a few helpful locals who hadn't fled or been killed. It was functional, enough to get by, but he knew his accent was terrible. He gestured toward the baby and asked if she needed milk, medicine, anything. The woman looked at him for a moment, as if deciding whether to answer, whether to trust this American soldier with his rifle and his tired eyes. Then she shook her head. Her voice was quiet, steady, with a trace of an accent he couldn't quite place. Not Bavarian, maybe from the north, Berlin perhaps, or Hamburg. She said the baby was fine. Carter nodded and moved on, continuing down the line. But something nagged at him. Maybe it was the way she held the child, not with the ease of a mother who had carried a baby for months, whose arms knew the weight and shape of it instinctively, but with the careful tension of someone carrying something fragile and foreign, something that might break if she held it wrong. He glanced back over his shoulder. She was looking down at the baby, whispering something he couldn't hear. Her lips moved like a prayer, or maybe a lullaby. The baby's tiny hand reached up, fingers brushing against her chin. She smiled, just barely, just for a second, a flicker of warmth that vanished as quickly as it appeared, and then the mask of exhaustion returned. Hours passed. The column resumed its march. The pace was slow, dictated by the weakest among them, the elderly, the sick, the children who couldn't keep up. Carter and Corporal David Brennan rode alongside in a jeep, keeping pace with the prisoners, ready to stop if anyone collapsed or if trouble started. Brennan was younger, 21, from a small town outside Cleveland, Ohio. He still had that boyish look, freckles across his nose, a smile that came easy when the moment allowed. The kind of face that made people back home think the war hadn't touched him, that he was still the same kid who had enlisted with stars in his eyes and dreams of glory. But Carter knew better. Brennan had killed men. He had seen things. He had held a dying friend in his arms and felt the life drain out of him. He just hid it better than most. Brennan was prone to making jokes to cut the tension, filling the silence with chatter about baseball, about the Indians and whether they'd have a shot at the pennant this year, about girls he'd known back home, about what he was going to do when he got back, open a garage maybe or go to college on the GI Bill. Carter usually let him talk. It was easier than contributing, easier than admitting that he couldn't imagine a future beyond the next day, the next week. Brennan pointed out the woman with the baby, said she looked like a Madonna from one of those old paintings his grandmother had hanging in her living room, the ones with the gold leaf and the sad eyes. Carter didn't laugh. He was still watching her. She walked with a limp, favoring her left leg. Every few steps she adjusted the baby in her arms, shifting the weight from one side to the other, trying to find a position that didn't hurt so much. But she never stopped, never asked for help, never handed the baby to anyone else, even when other women in the column offered, reaching out with arms that had carried their own children, their own burdens. Brennan noticed Carter's focus. He asked if something was wrong. Carter said he wasn't sure, just a feeling. Something off. Brennan shrugged it off, said the war made everyone paranoid, made you see threats where there weren't any, made you question everything, said Carter was seeing ghosts where there weren't any. Maybe he was right. Carter had been wrong before. He had mistaken a farmer for a soldier, shot at a shadow that turned out to be nothing, nearly killed a kid who had been hiding in a barn. The mind played tricks when you were tired enough, when you'd been running on adrenaline and fear for so long that you couldn't remember what normal felt like. But this didn't feel like a trick. This felt like something else, something he couldn't name, couldn't put into words. He told Brennan to keep an eye on her. Brennan raised an eyebrow but agreed. He said he'd watch, but he didn't see what Carter saw. No one did. Not yet. They reached a temporary holding area by nightfall, a clearing in the woods surrounded by hastily strung barbed wire and guarded by a handful of GIs who looked as tired as the prisoners. The prisoners were told to sit, rest, wait for processing in the morning. Most collapsed where they stood, too exhausted to care about comfort or safety or anything beyond the simple relief of not moving. A few started small fires with whatever scraps of wood they could find, breaking branches, tearing apart crates, feeding the flames with anything that would burn. The smell of smoke mixed with the scent of unwashed bodies and damp earth, creating a miasma that hung over the clearing like a fog. Carter watched as the woman found a spot near the edge of the group, away from the others, away from the fires and the conversations and the eyes. She sat with her back against a tree, the baby still cradled in her arms. She didn't start a fire, didn't talk to anyone, just sat there rocking slightly, humming a tune so faint it was almost imaginary, a melody that seemed to come from another world, another time. An older woman, gray-haired and hunched, her face weathered by years and hardship, approached her. They spoke briefly, words too quiet for Carter to hear. The older woman touched the baby's head with a gnarled hand, said something that made the younger woman's face tighten, then walked away, shaking her head. Carter saw the younger woman's face change, just for a moment. Her jaw tightened, her eyes closed. A single tear traced a line down her cheek, cutting through the dirt and grime like a river through a desert. Then she wiped it away with the back of her hand, composed herself with visible effort, and went back to rocking the baby, humming that same faint melody. Carter couldn't let it go. Something about the scene, about the woman's isolation, about the tear and the way she had wiped it away like it was a weakness she couldn't afford, pulled at him. He walked over to her, his boots crunching on the gravel and dead leaves. She looked up as he approached, her expression wary but not hostile. She had learned, like everyone else, that showing hostility to an American soldier was a bad idea. He crouched down to her level, trying to seem less threatening, trying to be something other than just another conqueror. He asked her name. She hesitated, glancing at the baby, then back at him, as if weighing the risks of answering. Finally, she spoke. Elsa. Elsa Hartman. Her voice was soft, almost melodic, despite the roughness of exhaustion. The kind of voice that belonged in a concert hall or a church choir, not in a muddy clearing surrounded by barbed wire. Carter nodded. He asked about the baby. Was it hers? She looked at him for a long time before answering, her blue eyes searching his face as if trying to determine whether he could be trusted, whether the truth would help or hurt. Her English was better than his German, each word carefully chosen, pronounced with precision. She said the baby's name was Anna. Carter pressed. He asked again, was the baby hers? Was she the mother? Elsa's expression didn't change. She said no. It wasn't hers. The words were simple, matter of fact, but they hit Carter like a punch to the gut. Carter felt his chest tighten. He asked where the mother was. Elsa looked down at Anna, brushed a strand of hair from the baby's forehead with a tenderness that seemed out of place in this landscape of ruin and death. She said the mother was dead, died 3 days ago, on the road, somewhere between one nameless town and another. Fever, exhaustion, maybe both, maybe something else. No one knew for sure. There had been no doctor, no medicine, no time to stop and bury her properly. The baby had been crying, screaming, inconsolable. No one else would take her. Everyone had their own burdens, their own children, their own survival to worry about. So Elsa did. She picked up the baby and she kept walking. Carter sat back on his heels, his mind racing. He didn't know what to say. The war had prepared him for a lot of things, for violence, for death, for the sight of things no human should have to see. But not this. Not a woman carrying a dead stranger's baby through the ruins of Germany, through a landscape of ash and horror, for no reason other than that no one else would. Brennan had walked up behind him, drawn by curiosity or boredom or the instinct to back up his sergeant. He had been listening. He muttered something about protocol, about how they'd need to report this, figure out what to do with the kid, get it to the Red Cross or an orphanage or wherever displaced children were supposed to go. Carter told him to shut up, his voice sharper than he intended. Brennan looked offended but stayed quiet, knowing better than to push when Carter got like this. Carter asked Elsa why. Why take a baby that wasn't hers? Why carry that weight, that responsibility, when she was barely surviving herself, when every extra ounce was a burden, when her own life was hanging by a thread? Elsa met his eyes. Her gaze was steady, unflinching, the kind of gaze that came from someone who had made a decision and wouldn't apologize for it. Her voice was calm, almost matter of fact, as if the answer was obvious. She said, "Someone had to." Those 3 words hung in the air like smoke, like the echo of a gunshot, like something you couldn't take back. Someone had to, as if it were the simplest truth in the world, as if there were no other choice, no other option, no other way to be human. As if the question itself was absurd. Carter stood up, walked a few paces away, needing distance, needing to think. He lit a cigarette with shaking hands, the flame from his lighter dancing in the cold evening air. The nicotine hit his lungs, sharp and familiar, a small comfort in a world that offered few. He exhaled slowly, watching the smoke dissipate into the darkening sky, carried away by a wind that smelled of rain and rot. Brennan joined him, hands in his pockets, shoulders hunched against the cold. He asked what they were going to do. Carter said he didn't know. He genuinely didn't. Brennan said they had to tell Lieutenant Howard. Regulations. Chain of command. Proper procedure. They couldn't just ignore this. Carter knew he was right. But he also knew what would happen if they followed the rules. The baby would be taken from Elsa's arms. She would scream, probably. Or maybe she wouldn't. Maybe she'd just let go, too tired to fight. The baby would be sent to some overcrowded orphanage or displaced persons camp, one of those places where children died of disease and neglect every day, where the workers were overwhelmed and undersupplied, where one more baby was just another number. Elsa would be processed, given a number of her own, shipped off to God knows where, forgotten like everyone else, another face in an endless column of faces. And that moment, that fragile, impossible act of humanity, would be buried under paperwork and procedure, lost to history like so many other moments that mattered. He took a long drag from his cigarette, exhaled slowly. He told Brennan to keep his mouth shut for now, just for now. They'd figure it out. Brennan frowned, clearly uncomfortable with breaking protocol, with bending rules. But he nodded. He said Carter was playing with fire. Carter said he knew. He'd been playing with fire since Normandy. What was one more risk? That night, Carter couldn't sleep. He sat on the hood of his Jeep, wrapped in a wool blanket, staring at the stars. They were the same stars he had seen in France, in Belgium, in every godforsaken place this war had taken him. The same stars his family could see back in Pennsylvania, his mother and father and little sister, living their lives in a world that felt impossibly far away. The thought should have been comforting, the idea that some things remained constant, that the universe didn't care about human wars. It wasn't comforting. It just made him feel small and alone. He thought about Elsa, about Anna, about the mother who had died on the road, her name lost to history, her body probably left in a ditch somewhere, unmarked and unmourned. He wondered what her last thoughts had been. Had she been scared watching the light fade, knowing she was leaving her baby behind? Had she hoped someone would take care of her child? Had she prayed? Or had she simply been too tired to care, too far gone to feel anything but relief that the struggle was finally over? He wondered what kind of person Elsa was, what she had been before the war. A teacher, maybe, patient and kind, the type of person children gravitated toward. A nurse used to caring for others, to putting their needs above her own. A shopkeeper, practical and resourceful. The war had a way of erasing those details, reducing people to their most basic functions. Survivor, prisoner, victim. But Elsa was something else. She was a woman who had chosen to carry a burden that wasn't hers, in a world that gave her every reason not to. And that choice, small as it seemed, felt monumental to Carter. It felt like the kind of thing that separated humans from animals, that made civilization possible, that made all of this suffering mean something. Morning came cold and gray, the sun hidden behind clouds that promised rain. The prisoners were lined up for processing, a long, slow procedure that involved checking names against lists, assigning numbers, determining destinations. Carter watched as Elsa stood with Anna still in her arms. The baby was awake now, making small noises, not quite crying but not quiet either, reaching up to touch Elsa's face with tiny, grasping fingers. Elsa smiled, barely, but it was there, a flicker of warmth that softened the hard lines of her face, a reminder that she was still human, still capable of feeling something other than exhaustion and fear. Carter walked over to Lieutenant Howard, a stiff, by-the-book officer who had seen too many wars and trusted too few people. Howard was in his 40s with graying haircut, military short, and a permanent scowl etched into his face. He had been career military before the war and would be career military after, assuming he survived. He didn't believe in bending rules. He believed in order, discipline, following the chain of command, getting the job done efficiently and without complications. Emotions were complications. Carter explained the situation, keeping his voice neutral, laying out the facts. Howard's face remained neutral, betraying nothing. He asked if the baby was sick, injured, a threat to anyone. Carter said no. Howard asked if the woman was a threat. Carter said no. Howard sighed, rubbed his temples with thick fingers, clearly annoyed at having to deal with this on top of everything else. He said he didn't have time for this. Too many prisoners, too much paperwork, too many problems that couldn't be solved with a rifle or a radio. He told Carter to handle it. Make sure the kid got to the Red Cross, make sure the woman got processed. Don't make it complicated. Don't make it his problem. Carter said he understood, but he didn't process Elsa. Not the way he was supposed to. Not yet. He told her to stay with the group heading to a displaced persons camp near Munich, one of the larger facilities that was supposed to have medical staff and supplies and some semblance of order. He made sure Anna stayed with her. He didn't file a report about the baby's origins. He didn't separate them. He pulled a few strings, called in a favor with a Red Cross liaison named Margaret, a tough, no-nonsense woman from Boston who had been in Europe since '43 and had seen more than her share of tragedy. He made sure Elsa's name was on the list for the camp, made sure there was a note saying the baby was in her care, temporary guardianship pending further investigation. It wasn't much. It wouldn't last forever. Eventually someone would ask questions, would want documentation, would demand proof of relationship, but it was something. It bought time. It gave Elsa and Anna a chance. Brennan asked him later why he did it, why he risked his career, his reputation, for two people he didn't know and would probably never see again. Carter said he didn't know. Maybe because the war had taken enough from people. Maybe because he was tired of watching people lose the last scraps of their humanity. the last pieces of themselves that made life worth living. Maybe because Elsa's answer, someone had to, had lodged itself in his chest like shrapnel, painful and impossible to remove. A reminder that even in the worst circumstances people could still choose to be good. Brennan said Carter was a fool, that he was going to get himself in trouble, that Howard would figure it out eventually. Carter said maybe. But he slept a little better that night, the first decent sleep he'd had in weeks. Weeks later, after the surrender, after Hitler's suicide in his bunker, after the flags came down and the camps were liberated, and the full scope of the horror became undeniable, after the chaos began to settle into something resembling order, Carter heard that Elsa and Anna had made it to the camp in Bavaria. A Red Cross worker, Margaret herself, told him they were together. The baby was healthy, gaining weight, responding well to regular feedings. Elsa had refused to give her up, even when officials suggested it might be better for the child to be placed with a family, with people who had resources and stability. She told them the same thing she told Carter. Someone had to. The worker said they were trying to find surviving family for Anna, going through records, checking lists of the dead and displaced, putting out notices. But until then, Elsa was all Anna had. And maybe, Margaret said with a tired smile, that was enough. Carter never saw them again, but he thought about them often, about that moment in the clearing, about the way Elsa held a child that wasn't hers, like it was the only thing in the world that mattered, about the 3 words that had changed something in him. He wondered if Anna would ever know the truth, if she would grow up hearing the story of the woman who saved her, or if it would be lost like so many other stories from the war, buried under time and silence, and the desire to forget. He hoped it wouldn't be. He hoped someone would remember. He hoped Anna would know that in the darkest moment of history, when the world had gone mad and humanity seemed like a joke, one woman had chosen to carry her through the ruins. Years later, decades later, when the war was a chapter in history books and the veterans were old men with medals and memories, Carter would tell the story to his own children. He would sit in his living room in Pennsylvania, in the house he bought with his GI Bill loan, with his wife beside him and his kids gathered around, and he would describe the columns of prisoners, the bombed-out villages, the faces of people who had lost everything, and then he would tell them about Elsa, about a woman who, in the middle of the worst humanity had to offer, chose to carry a baby that wasn't hers. Not because she had to, not because anyone forced her, not because there was a reward or recognition or even a thank you, but because someone had to. And that, he would say, his voice thick with emotion even after all those years, was the difference between surviving a war and surviving it with your soul intact. His children would listen, wide-eyed, and ask if Elsa and Anna were okay, if they lived happily ever after like in the fairy tales. Carter would say he didn't know. He hoped so. He liked to think they were, that somewhere in the rebuilt Germany, or maybe America, or maybe anywhere in the world that had moved on from the nightmare, they were living quiet lives, that Anna had grown up loved, that she had gone to school and made friends and fallen in love, and had children of her own, that Elsa had found peace, had been able to put down the burden she carried for so long, had been able to rest, but he didn't know. And maybe that was okay. Maybe not every story needed a neat ending tied up with a bow. Maybe some stories were important simply because they happened, because they existed, because they reminded us of something we needed to remember. The war ended. Germany rebuilt, rising from the ashes with a determination that surprised everyone. The dead were buried in cemeteries that stretched for miles. The living moved on because that's what the living do. Monuments were erected, histories were written, veterans grew old and told their stories at reunions and schools and to grandchildren who couldn't quite imagine what it had been like. But some moments don't fade. Some acts of grace, however small, however quiet, however unrecorded in the official histories, remain. They live in memories, in stories passed down, in the small ways they change the people who witness them. Elsa Hartmann carrying baby Anna through the ruins of 1945 was one of them. A reminder that humanity doesn't die in war. It gets buried, hidden, beaten down until it seems like it's gone forever. But it doesn't die. It survives in the small choices, the quiet acts, the moments when someone decides that mercy matters more than survival, that compassion matters more than self-preservation. Carter carried that lesson with him for the rest of his life. It shaped how he raised his children, how he treated his neighbors, how he thought about the world. When he died, decades later, an old man in a hospital bed with his family around him, his children found a small photograph in his belongings. It was worn, faded, the edges frayed from being carried in a wallet for years. It showed a woman holding a baby, standing in front of a tree. The woman's face was tired, but peaceful. The baby was looking at the camera. On the back, in Carter's handwriting, were 3 words: "Someone had to." His children never found out who the woman was. They asked, but their father had never told them, had taken that secret to his grave. But they kept the photograph, and they told the story. And that in the end is how we keep the past alive. Not through monuments or medals or official histories, but through stories. Through the quiet acts of grace that remind us what it means to be human, what it means to choose kindness when cruelty would be easier, what it means to carry a burden that isn't yours because someone has to, and you're the one standing there when the moment comes. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of something important, if it made you think about the choices you make and the person you want to be, then subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments. History is full of forgotten heroes, people who did extraordinary things in ordinary moments, people whose names were never recorded, but whose actions mattered. Let's make sure their stories are told. Let's make sure we remember.